An incredible week. We're going to have to start all over again. So It's an incredible week. It just seems to get more and more busy. The news never stops. But let's talk about SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, you give the introduction.
In 2001, I think.
Same time as WTO, China enters WTO.
Right. But I think it's right after 9/11, when a lot of the so-called extremist organizations were active in Afghanistan and Pakistan and the neighboring countries of the Stans. And I think China was also becoming a target for some, and Russia, of course. So I think these countries basically formed to form an alliance to deal with terrorism.
But it's not really an alliance in the sense of like NATO. This was simply making sure that terrorists are operating on my soil and attacking your country.
That's right.
Yeah, and it was extremism, terrorism, and separatism.
That's right.
And those are still the whole thing. So this almost completely internal. There are no external threats except the terrorism itself. So quite different from NATO.
Yeah. There was another thing, I think at that time, is the U.S. moving into Afghanistan. First time an outside force was moving in to impact the region.
Well, it's not the first time the U.S. has done that. I mean, there have been 72 adventures since World War II where the U.S. has engaged in changing regimes.
So, I mean, for that region.
Oh, for that region.
So that would be U.S. moving into that region.
Oh, but wait a second. Going back to when the Russians were there.
And before that, the British.
Before the British, we were also there. I mean, we were the ones who were giving the Mujahideen, who then became the Taliban, all the guns and rockets and everything they needed to fight the Russians. And guess what? They used them to fight us, the U.S.
I wonder whether or not something like that will happen in Ukraine as well. But
it's already happening. There are reports that there are U.S. weapons now readily available on the black market to the highest bidder.
At a discount.
Well, let us say when it's all good money if somebody gave it to you for free.
But coming back to SCO, I think the meeting this time was particularly interesting because it's expanded further.
What do you think of Iran joining? I mean, controversial. It starts to put more and more countries that are on the opposite side of the United States in the same area. I mean, you have Iran, Russia, China, to some extent Pakistan, and
But what about Saudi Arabia?
Well, not only Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Yemen, and
UAE was the best. You heard about this, I'm sure. UAE said they want to skip the observer phase and become a member immediately.
Well, that's a big issue because what you do is you have the stands, and then you have the Middle East, all interested. And unlike other groupings, this one includes Iran.
That's right.
And I've been saying for a long time, I think the only way that you can bring people together is not bilaterally anymore. It's just too difficult. There's too much nationalism. No one can back down. I can't give an inch. This
Domestic
kind of talk.
politics.
Domestic politics. But if you're all part of the same group and everyone's sitting around and it's consensus and all the neighbors say this would be good for the neighborhood, I think it is a lot easier. And you see this with RCEP. I mean, Japan, South Korea, no problem being in the RCEP. Right?
That's right.
Yeah. So,
dealing with concrete issues that benefits the countries and people. Yeah.
But that's what really struck me about this. This in tone and in the way it's organized is completely different from the U.S. approach. The U.S. approach would have been, come to us. We carry the torch. Follow me. If you don't follow me, I guess you're an enemy. in this thing. You have parties that are very at loggerheads. I mean, China, India, Pakistan, yeah,
Saudi Arabia, and Iran.
In Iran. But even currently, there are two stands who are engaging in live fire right now, and 40, 50 people have actually died. But they're both leaders were there. And I'm not saying that it's good to have the warfare, but it is good to have leaders meeting. And in a situation where everyone's going to say, look, this isn't good. I mean, you guys fighting is not a part of what we want to do in terms of combating terrorism, territorial integrity, all of these things. This is what I see as this new way of doing things that China wants to push.
Regional collaboration.
It's not a regional
collaboration.
In the international, what was the phrase that they're using? GI, Global Security Initiative. Mm-hmm. And this really seems to be the way it's rolling out. It's collaborative. It is consensus driven. Mm-hmm. No one is setting the stage or saying ideologically you have to do this or that. We simply say, we get together, we have common problems.
We talk.
We talk.
Yeah.
And not only talk, but we actually do things. I mean, there are a lot of things that came out of that meeting in terms of making sure that countries can go through each other's countries unimpeded for trade, because that's a security issue. You had India asking Pakistan for free access through Pakistan to Afghanistan and other places.
There's another interesting aspect. If you come back to what you were saying before, U.S. gathers groups to beat up on other people.
Exactly.
And here, groups gather, even enemies gather to talk things out and work on collaborating in areas in which they can collaborate in, which is very positive. I think that this is really indicative of the change in the world geopolitics today.
But is it changing? Because, on one side, we have the United States, Europe to a large extent, the Five Eyes, the English-speaking former colonial nations.
AUKUS.
Together with AUKUS, but, real question about where India stands as part of all these different groups. It seems to be a real joiner. But they're pushing, as you said, a hard agenda that unless you're a liberal, democratic, capitalist country, we will interfere in your business. We see it as our duty to change that. And that is the developed North. You start looking at the global South, the stands. And global South includes South America, Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, China to a certain extent. And now Russia in the stands. All of a sudden you see a geopolitical shift where the colonial nations are actually, in decline. They are not controlling the board the way they used to. And I'm not going on in terms of Ukraine and using it as a litmus test. I'm just saying that these nations don't want somebody dictating to them. Like in South Africa, we've talked about it last week, when Jesus said, look, we're a sovereign nation. We don't need something, we don't want our policies being made in other capitals. I mean, isn't that strange?
And we don't want policies which obviously are detrimental to our interest and to our country's people, our people's livelihood even, to be imposed on us. And this is what coming back to this subject, we talked about this before. I had a long conversation with a bunch of Korean businessmen yesterday.
Oh.
And it's very interesting. They fully recognize what the U.S. is trying to do in terms of the chip sector. And the damage to them will be absolutely huge.
Yeah, but I don't understand. Do U.S. policymakers really think that people are that stupid?
I think they do.
We're going to take your business and you should like it? You should thank us?
Yeah, I think they are. I think, number one, we've talked about this a number of times. You don't see statesmen anymore. You don't see strategists.
You don't need a statesman to understand that I'm going to take your business away and you should thank me. I mean, the chip business is such a huge part of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Right. And the U.S. says, we're taking that back for safekeeping. We're going to keep it here. Never mind the fact that it'll be uncompetitive. I mean, the assumption is, and I think it's a racial assumption, that if America brings back the high technology, the West will own the technology. And everybody else will have to come begging for these chips. But it's just not true. The advanced chip production is in the East, not in the West.
That's right.
And to move it across the pond is going to require an immense amount of money, even more than the $76 billion or whatever it is that the U.S. is putting in direct subsidies over the next 5 years.
Not only that, I think my Korean friends tell me that it's physically impossible to transplant a lot of these facilities in the U.S. because of U.S. lack of infrastructure, lack of engineering talent, lack of supplies of intermediate goods, even. So
well, they're going to cut off China, and that's where the intermediate goods are.
That's right.
So, to me, it makes no sense. What are you hearing financially?
Financially, in terms of Korea?
No, all of it. I mean, you were mentioning earlier, you were talking some people who have in Europe, and all of a sudden Germany is investing a lot in China.
They have no choice because energy and electricity, let's just say, generally speaking, is so expensive in Germany now that they have to physically transplant their facilities to Asia and especially China because of the existence of good infrastructure, including power supply.
Yeah, but what I see here is these competing currents.
Yeah.
But one current is going nowhere. I mean, this idea that the U.S. and Europe can separate, can dictate, can tell people ideologically, economically, militarily what the situation is. You see, as I said, a huge wave of groups who are basically just saying, no, we're not interested anymore. We're going to pursue our own interests, and our own interests don't align with yours.
Well, take the Germans, for example, right? If, for example, BASF shuts down their German factories, there will be thousands of companies downstream using their chemical materials, which have to go shut down.
No, they'll produce in. They have large. They'll produce in China, but the issue, your point is that a lot of people will lose their jobs. But if they try to keep them there, the price of these chemicals is going to go through the roof.
Yeah.
All right, and I can't quite figure out why this makes sense anymore. Anyways, I want to go on anything more to add on that?
No.
All right. There's been a hot search topic on Baidu and nationally. It says the downfall of China, right? This is it between, the COVID and the banking crisis and real estate. This is the end. Now, I recall The Economist magazine used to almost on a yearly basis for more than 20 years, almost since the beginning of 2001, they would put out, this is the year that China goes under.
1998, Professor Gordon Chang's book, The Oncoming Collapse of the Chinese Economy. So we've been listening to this for more than 2 decades, huh?
Yeah, but I mean, what I don't understand is China has problems, right?
Sure.
But they also have the tools and the will to implement solutions. We're not seeing that in the United States. The infrastructure problems there are continuing. They're getting worse, right? Yet they're saying that we want to attract first world business. We want to be the leader of the world economically, even though we don't have, politically, we're looking at perhaps a civil war, right? 20% of our populace has faith in the current government. Is this the place you want to say, okay, long term, this is where I want to be?
Long term, there's no question that Asia is rising and will continue to rise with the Chinese market at its core. If U.S. wants to disengage, Walmart will have to shut down because more than 50% of its products are made in China. But Asia will continue to do well.
But they can't shut down. Right now you have massive inflation.
Yeah.
And this friendshoring, onshoring nonsense is only going to raise prices. It raises prices, but then it makes those companies uncompetitive.
That's right.
Versus places that make them more cheaply. I mean, this was the mantra that
of
for how many globalization.
Yeah.
At what point does it become no? This is not good anymore. I think it was just simply because people in the West got greedy. They took home 2/3 of the profits since 2001.
I have to say, this is part of my conversation with the Korean think tank that I was quite upset by. The line they pushed very hard was the biggest benefactor of WTO and globalization is China, was China, and is China. I would like to think of this as mutually beneficial. Without China's manufacturing capacity and economies of scale and super high efficiency, can the U.S. continue to have low-cost products that keeps their inflation down?
Well, it's not only that, but for Korea to say that is interesting, since their dependency on the Chinese market is huge. They're in a large part of their economy as an export nation is dependent on a very healthy China, expanding China, where they've had tremendous amounts of sales. Same with Japan, all of Asia.
You were around the financial crisis of 1997, and also the financial crisis of 2008. In 1997-98, what was particularly interesting was Asian currencies were hit really, really hard.
Yeah.
And the dollar became very strong, and hedge funds from the US started buying assets on the cheap.
Yeah.
In Japan, in Korea, en masse. I remember buying Japanese banks for, 35 cents on the dollar and so on and so forth. Now, this time around, at that time, what was hit particularly hard with Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. This time around, it seems that it's Japan and Korea who've been hit hardest.
Developed nations across the board, because Europe is also being hit really hard with this.
The euro.
And you hear this leaking sound of money from Europe being dissipated, whether it's through inflation. Inflation as a whole, is making people poor. But then money is flowing out for food and oil, plus intermediate goods.
That's right.
And the U.S. is, saying, well, we're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian.
And the dollar gets really strong. What happens then? European assets become very cheap. And there are all these M&A deals being looked at by major U.S. capital.
Yeah, but do you really want to buy into Europe right now, given the situation? We're looking at social unrest that's going to come. High food prices, high energy prices, probably a very bleak winter. There are going to be changes in government. Personally, I want to do business in an area where I can calculate what the forward risks are, because I don't go into business to make something, to take massive risks on Forex or infrastructure or political risk. I do it because I think there's a market there, and I believe I can do something better than somebody else.
And just following along the same line, look at China. Okay. What the Chinese government has been able to do, and the Chinese people have been able to demonstrate, is that they've been able to address problems.
I know, but why does China get such a bad rap for doing it? I always say that China's original sin is to succeed, because it can't possibly be that, non-white people can be successful. That they can invent things. Remember when we were growing up in the U.S., well, you people are good at math.
That's right.
All right. But you're
good at running restaurants.
And Cleaners. Don't forget the cleaners.
Oh, yes.
Yes. And a few of you are professors, but you're not management material because you're not creative and you're not go-getters, and you just lack that spark.
Drive.
The drive. And I still see vestiges of that. People still tell me what I'm good at. It has nothing to do with what I'm actually good at.
It's absolutely racism, and it's colonial heritage and all of that. But unfortunately, that will probably not go away for quite some time. Yeah.
I think it gets worse after a while.
Yeah.
I mean, people they're going to some emotional unreality in order to deal with the really, really difficult things they're facing. And I really do feel bad for people because, as you said, the lack of statesmen, the lack of a system that can produce people who are capable of running the government. I mean, Liz Truss, Great Britain, she's been boycotted from the royal family. She's not allowed to go on a trip with King Charles. He doesn't want her. I mean, it's just, how is it possible? And then, what do you think of King Charles? I think it's going to change. There's a lot of questions about what happens to the monarchy.
That's right.
After her death.
Well, a lot of the Commonwealth countries are also reevaluating the whole system.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a tremendous amount of respect for her as a person, as an individual, but not necessarily for the system that she represents. I mean, there's a story about how $1 billion estate will go to Charles basically tax-free. Where did that money come from? I mean, that money came from, Great Britain's rise.
Colonial exploitation.
What it took from Africa.
Yeah.
What it took from India,
Yeah.
Asia
That's
a whole. I mean, this was an empire where the sun never set. Well,
in plundering the developing countries.
Yes. Yeah. And I can understand why, people, Aborigines in Australia are saying, well, gee whiz, she's a nice lady, but I don't really hold with what she represents in terms of a colonial past. Or
not only that, I think I would even go one step further. She represents and make the British reminisce about the days of glory of colonialism.
I know, but I never understand. I talk to some British people, and they talk about the good old days, the British Empire, as if it was something nice. Yet, when you confront them and say, well, a lot of bad things happened. You guys raped, robbed, and ruined. They say, oh, we brought civilization to the world. There is a plus and a minus. All of these types of things. Can you imagine? India was almost 1/4 of the world's GDP before the British came in
and plundered it away.
And what was it? 4% afterwards they left. I mean, statistics are just what they are.
And if you talk about moral standards, what is the Opium War all about?
Yeah, but I mean, it's always glossed over. I mean, they talk about Hong Kong and all this stuff, and you say, but you got that in a drug deal. You basically took a gun, put it to the head of China, and said, "Give me this land, or I'll blow your brains out." And this is
by
supposed to be
our opium.
And you have no choice. We are your drug dealer.
That's
right. I mean, this is mafia stuff. If you put it in a modern day movie, people would say this is unbelievable.
And Americans should understand, Europeans should understand, the British should understand, that to the Chinese people, it will never happen again.
And this is something that I don't think people understand. When they talk about Taiwan, for the Chinese side, they see it as a return of colonial gunboat diplomacy.
That's right.
Trying to rip away another part of a country that is not theirs.
That's right. And another part of a country which has never invaded anyone, never occupied anyone, when they could have, China could have taken down all of Southeast Asia if it wanted to.
Well, they didn't want to.
But
there's a fundamental part of China, which most people who come here for any period of time understand, is that it's very inward focused. They have 1.4 billion people, land mass, roughly equivalent or slightly larger than the U.S.
U.S., yeah.
And they're concerned with running their country and taking care of people. They're not saying, gee whiz, wouldn't it be nice to take over Japan or something like this? If you talk to somebody on the street and said, do you want to invade Japan? How about Australia or something like that? They'd look at you like, why? Why would we have enough problems at home?
That's right.
We're trying to raise our living here. We don't need to spend money on wars. And
unlike Americans, the American government, that they don't think very much about taking care of its own people. They think about the 800 military bases all over the world.
Well, no, I mean another 600 million here for another more war efforts for Ukraine. I mean, it seems to be you can turn the spigot on as long as there's a war involved. But when it comes to vaccines, peace, hunger, the starving people in Afghanistan, the incredible situation, tragedy that's happening in Pakistan. With these floods, I don't hear a peep. I don't hear any efforts to address it. There's just nothing going on. It's just Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. We're standing up. They're beating Russia.
I know it's going to get worse and worse because I think in addition to the general views on climate change that we see, the food problem is becoming very serious, and even more serious today than just a few weeks ago or a few months ago, where Vladimir Putin, in his statement at the SEO, talked about providing fertilizers
for free
to developing countries. And the Koreans were telling me that over 90% of their urea, which is a fertilizer, comes from China.
Yep.
But China is now shipping more to Pakistan and African countries, so they're not getting the supplies they need. Or prices have gone up. That's why your kimchi, it's going to be more expensive.
Well, they don't put urea in kimchi, just to make that sure. I mean, there'll be a very, very, that's always a bone of contention. No, it is true. I mean, China has been quietly pushing it. They're the ones who forgave tens of billions of loans at
least developed
countries. Where was the response from the U.S.? Oh, we're going to match that, okay, or we're going to do it. I mean, this Sri Lankan thing, China's 10%. 81% is held by Western developed countries, and yet somehow China's is the problem. Yeah, China's forgiving loans. The rest of them aren't. But somehow it comes back that China's the problem.
The others would describe it differently, Einar.
How? How can you have 81%, China has 10%.
We're happy to do a restructuring of the deal.
Yes. We were both in the banking. Restructuring, what does that mean? We're going to really rape, rob, and pillage you.
Exactly.
Because you have no leverage and we have it all.
That's right.
And we're going to take you to the cleaners.
That's right.
You'll be indebted to my great-great-great-great-grandchildren.
That's right.
No.
Restructuring.
Ugh. It's terrible.
Coming back to the issue of China addressing the problems that it faces, like you said, it's inward looking because it has so many problems to address and so many people that have to be fed, whose livelihood has to be improved, right? 600 million people taken out of poverty and so on and so forth. I think there is another aspect to this, is we've talked about this before. The government's focus is on improving the wealth of the nation, the wealth of the population, the wealth of society, and hence its better life, for its people.
But why is that so hard to sign? For 40 years, China has been consistent in dealing with internal matters, trying to increase the lot of the ordinary person.
Yeah.
And they've succeeded. Yeah. And yet, continually vilified. They have, instead of closing their borders and saying, we're happy, we don't need to help anybody else, they're saying, look, for regional peace, we need to, and for the economic realities, we need to start shifting some of the labor-intensive manufacturing, industrialization out. All right? Why? It stabilizes these countries. It gives them the opportunity to go through the same cycle that China did. Mm-hmm. That is, earn their way out of their poverty, create the kind of infrastructure that allowed them to succeed, create stable markets, bring up disposable income. Mm-hmm. Generally, in rising middle-class countries, there's less threat of war and terrorism, etc.
More social stability.
More social stability. So if China was doing something evil or something, okay, let's bring that to the forefront. But it isn't there, and I don't get it. But let's talk a little bit about evil. Donald Trump. I mean,
Civil War.
He's back to the same thing that led to January 6th.
That's right.
He's saying the American people won't stand for it. That's exactly what he said. I've been cheated. I won the election. Now I didn't commit a crime. I'm just waiting for him to do the Nixon thing. I am not a crook.
Well, he's basically saying that it's gonna be trouble, right?
He's saying that there's going to if you put me in jail, there'll be civil war.
Yeah,
and this is his threat. Why is he making this threat? Because he's been caught red-handed with nuclear secrets, with compromise on leaders, and has no way of explaining it. They spent a year asking him to return this stuff, and he refused time after time after time. Now they go into his house, they find the stuff. He can't say he didn't have it. He's making up this stuff about, maybe I declassified it. Yeah, that's it. Well, there's a process for that. He didn't follow the process. And you don't declassify the nuclear secrets of other countries that you have on the highest level
of security.
Yeah. It's not like, what we know about India, Israel, Pakistan, and their nuclear programs, we'll just declassify. Let everybody know. Yeah. I mean, it's not credible. So he's down to threats.
But, Einar, he's not credible to rational, sane, and fairly sophisticated people, which unfortunately...
Yeah, you see, you say that. I know a lot of people who support Trump. And it's emotional, but I can't say that they're irrational people. I can't say that they're bad people. Mm-hmm. All right? But they have engaged in just going... I don't know if it's to the right or left, or it's a cult. Every time you say something, there's always an excuse. For instance, Donald Trump said that he's the master. He knows how to pick people. He had The Apprentice, right?
Right.
It was all about, I know how to pick people. I can find the best people, and the best people like working for me. And yet you look on CNN, it's not all the commentators now who are going after him are from his administration. His public spokespeople, his aides, people who he chose to work in the closest confines of the White House are the ones who are providing all the material on how critical and how insane he is.
I have to say, this could be a system-wide issue or problem, because what we hear out of the White House now in Washington's press is there are all kinds of battles among administration senior officials, among the closest aides to Mr. Biden, President Biden, in terms of policy, in terms of where to go politically, in terms of the midterm elections. It's actually a White House which is extremely confused and diffused right now in terms of not being able to take hard, solid policy strategic decisions.
But isn't that a reflection of Joe Biden?
Yes.
And I'm not saying Joe Biden, I think, tries to be a fairly decent guy. I mean, there's questions about Hunter Biden, what he knows, and things like that, and some in the past. But he has not been known in Washington as somebody who's trying to stuff his pockets.
That's right.
And he did come up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, from a very, very difficult situation economically. His father was not a rich man. And he does believe in unions, but we're old guys. He's really old. And his ideas are all about the past. Yeah. Let's return to the past when the good old days were. But there were no good old days.
It's very interesting what you say about how a lot of supporters of Donald Trump are actually rational and fairly sophisticated people and are educated people as well. He does have the blue collars.
The vast majority are disenfranchised.
Right.
People from the lower middle classes who feel, and rightly so, that for the 40 years that China's been rising, they have been going sideways and down. Their numbers have decreased. They have real no hope. So I can understand why these people are angry, but
it's not only just in America, but I think Europeans as well, as exemplified even by some Korean comments that I heard from Korean businessmen. They keep on stressing how China benefited from the WTO and globalization, right? Forgetting they themselves benefited, Europeans benefited, Americans benefited, everybody benefited from enhanced efficiency. And like you said, enhanced efficiency, what does that mean? You have
lower costs
all over the world. People can enjoy a better life. Now, losing that competitiveness for the Europeans and the Americans is one part. But the biggest issue today for Europe and the United States, maybe partly because of the war, partly because of the money printing, is inflation. It's inflation. If the goods cost, every good starts to cost more, you're going to have a runaway inflation.
Well, I keep going back. 63% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. It means they can't afford what they got this month, because they had 8.3% inflation, which was higher. We've got to talk about that too. But, it's just inconceivable to me that people can't just do the simple math. Okay, here, if I raise costs, it's going to impact my people. I can't pay them more because there's no productivity increase. And all I'm doing is pushing more and more of my people into poverty.
Speaking of which, what have you heard about the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom plans in terms of solving the electricity price problem?
Subsidies.
Subsidies.
No, wait a second. That's what communist socialist countries do, right? Subsidies.
That's right.
Where's the money coming from?
I don't think there was any explanation of where the money is coming from.
But she made a Winston Churchill type speech. She said, "We will weather the storm." I don't think that's not convincing anybody.
This subsidy thing, there was some talk, I read commentaries in the Financial Times on this, that she actually has plans to set ceilings on electricity prices. How do you do that?
Well, it sounds good. I'm going to set a ceiling. You'll pay no more than you did last year. Well, the electricity costs more. Well, it's two things. The electricity company shuts down because they said, I can't afford to pay people to take electricity because my costs are higher. Or
there'll be no supply.
No supply. Obviously, she wants the power, but doesn't have a clue how she intends to use it. Let's talk about a little bit about something that really bothered me last week. And I generally respect and have a great admiration for the PM of New Zealand. But she came out with this statement that we are no longer going to allow to the effect of COVID to dictate our life. At the same time as she's saying that, I'm going through an article which talks about the fact that in addition, there 1 million people plus died in the United States because of COVID-19. But the reason there's an employment issue is because 500,000 people of them were working. So you lost 500,000 people. Now, it wasn't through death. Many of them are experiencing what they call this long COVID. So between 5 and 8% of the people who get COVID, are experiencing symptoms 3 months afterwards. And on a declining basis, 3 to 4% of them are experiencing a year later. And it doesn't seem to be going away. And when I say experience, they can't think clearly. They've lost sense of smell, sense of taste.
Functions of organs.
And the functions of organs have been impacted. So, the Fed is running around like crazy saying, well, as long as employment's high, that means the economy is strong. Well, if you take out 500,000 people from your economy, no, it isn't strong. You're just simply having people playing musical chairs, trying to fill them instead of trying to keep people out.
There's another aspect. I don't remember the numbers that they quoted. A lot of people decided to leave the workforce altogether.
Yeah, but they left. They're taking some time, but at a certain point, there's going to be a stampede back because the mortgage doesn't pay itself. Right? Everything is going up in price, including the cup of coffee that they buy from Starbucks. So at a certain point, these people who said, look, we're just going to take a beat, we're tired of COVID, or we moved, or whatever reason, they're going to need to start earning income. And when that happens, you're going to see a dramatic shift.
Unemployment,
job opportunities, everything like that. It's going to really, really be tough. And then what do? I mean, you have a situation where people can't support themselves. You can either watch them, join the homeless queues, join the soup kitchens that are already overburdened. Can't do it. I mean, 10.1% of America is below the poverty line. 10.1%. I mean, how is it possible? You have people who literally make enough to feed that 10.1% in 1 year.
And Einar, I keep on thinking about the social responsibility aspect of ESG. Social responsibility, when you have 10.1% having trouble to feed itself and have more than 500,000 homeless sleeping in the streets, where is the social responsibility that the U.S. government and the U.S. corporate world committed itself to?
Well, but you have all these people. You have Bernie Sanders. Okay, you have the young lady AOC. AOC. And they're talking about student loans and things like that. And I'm sympathetic, but where is the help for a significant percentage of Americans? Where is the mental health issues have increased because of COVID? Opiates, irresponsible, evil, I would say, not irresponsible, evil pharma companies that were pushing opioids even though they knew it was killing people and enslaving people, pushing them into poverty, into crime. And they didn't care. The Sackler family is still going to be able to keep a large amount of its wealth, even though that they've done this. I mean, if the Sackler family had been in China and had discovered doing this,
in jail,
no, dead,
executed.
Yeah, many of them would be executed, but there's no question that they would be able to keep their wealth. That would have been taken immediately. I'm not saying that I'm in favor of the death penalty, but I'm saying that there would be very quick final action against people who do this. They would not be able to walk around and drive around in their Mercedes and Bentleys and things like that, looking down at the world. They would be automatically put in jail where they should be. And you don't see that. So if you're not willing to help people and you're not willing to punish those who are destroying people, what kind of society do you have?
One thing which I find to be, I don't want to say a blessing, or that makes me optimistic, is all of this information is now being spread much more widely and broadly among the global South.
Yeah, there seems to be a real movement in that direction.
That's right.
Is it anti-colonialism, or has simply the hypocrisy?
It's a combination of exactly these factors that you've cited. Anti-colonialism, even India, I shouldn't say India, even India, but India came out with a very strong statement as part of the eulogy for Queen Elizabeth in terms of the colonial heritage of the UK in robbing India,
And robbing's the right word.
That's right. So you have that, anti-colonialism. The second part is the hypocrisy of the narratives of the mainstream Western media, and also U.S. government, some European government, in terms of criticizing others, but actually doing 10 times worse things themselves, you know? So all of these things are now being spread throughout the global south. I find very interesting speaking to diplomats from ASEAN countries nowadays compared to ASEAN diplomats 10 years ago, let alone 20, 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago when I was at the United Nations. The level of sophistication of these diplomats today compared to them is unparalleled. It just cannot be compared.
They've gone to the best schools and they have a very clear understanding of their own history and the kind of power politics that's been, basically been on the menu for the last 30 years.
That's right. So that's a good thing,
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about India. India, there was a lot of will Modi meet Xi, and apparently they had a very cordial exchange at the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. But before then, there was this orderly withdrawal from the hot springs area, this area of contention on the border of China and India. Is there a rapprochement coming?
Well, you're on Indian press and Indian TV quite a bit.
Well, I don't take that as a good indicator. I was on last week and they were talking about if China invites Modi to meet, should Modi go? And I said, those are really kind of stretching the hypothetical a little bit. If something happens, then be. Well, I said, why don't you just say that any kind of dialogue is good, given that troops are withdrawing from hot point areas. You don't have this eyeball to eyeball of troops. It seems like things are going in the right direction. And
I think India India has always had some serious problems to deal with in terms of its population, lack of infrastructure, and the slow pace of development. Where 40 years ago, per capita GDP of India was $1 less than Chinese per capita GDP. Today is 1/5 China's 500%. But I think what's interesting is, given the problems of climate change, the climate crisis actually, given the problems of energy prices worldwide, food prices, fertilizer prices, all of this, India has to address its immediate problems. And
but why would that mean going to the East? Simply because the East is more organized?
Where else are they going to go? India is now India was a major food exporter. Now it's becoming a food importer.
Yeah.
And that's serious. Energy comes from Russia. Cheap energy comes from China.
Also a lot of their weapons systems.
That's right. Yeah. So what are they going to get from the U.S.?
Aside from nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. Except maybe a couple of joint military exercises just to irk the Chinese,
Yeah, even the sales of weapons has been kind of curtailed because India has so many weapon systems from Russia.
That's right. So I think India or Modi or his advisors can easily seen if you collaborated with Russia, with China, there's some very concrete results that can come from it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially at a time when you need whatever is cheapest.
That's right. Whatever is cheapest and feed your people.
Yeah. I noticed that Modi made a statement about the Ukraine situation. It's fairly mild. He says this is a time for peace. And quite clearly, Xi Jinping, although he didn't come out and say it, Putin said it for him, says, we understand your concerns and we welcome your balanced approach. But quite clearly, throughout this SCO meeting, the message was, it is time for peace.
Yeah.
And everybody, and I think that is very powerful. That's very different from somebody dictating, says, you make peace or I'll, make war? Or you're already in a war.
Yeah.
But, you're sitting with a group of your more or less peers in terms of their sovereign countries. And everyone's kind of saying, this isn't going well for any of us. Forget the US and Europe and all that kind of situation. The situation is this is hurting all of us. A lot of them are developing emerging countries. It's not good.
That's right. That's right. Especially the fertilizer side and the food side. So much of the food of Europe and North Africa come from the region.
Okay, what else we have? Oil prices were down.
5%? Something like that.
But I mean, there's a whole series of events. One, 8.3% inflation. Market goes nuts. Big dump. One of the biggest sell-offs in the last, 20 years?
Yeah.
And then oil prices, of course, drop. Dollar strengthens. Fed comes, it makes it very clear they're just dying to pump in. It was 75 basis points, maybe 100 basis points onto the Fed rate. And, it just...
OPEC announces reduction of production.
That doesn't matter. I mean, people, this is a misunderstanding. Oil is fine in the world. The issue is logistics. It doesn't matter if they doubled production.
If you can't get out there, yeah.
I can't get it. I can't get it. So right now, it's a lot about the logistics. But you saw a big drop in that as shipping all of a sudden has dropped due to general global demand, things like that.
That's going to happen because if European economy continues to deteriorate as it is now, and U.S. economy is in a very messy state, what will happen to global demand? It will decline.
Well, global demand is a decline, but the kind of demand that I'm talking about, I always differentiate what I call necessities, things you have to have, and choices, things that you would like. An Hermes bag is not a necessity.
Depends on who you're talking to.
Yes, who you're talking to, yes. But I mean, food, energy is. I still believe that food and energy are going to be still impacted because you had areas where the food and energy the distance between them was very short. For instance, gas. Gas was coming from Russia. It's cheap to put gas in a pipeline and send it somewhere. It is expensive to compress it, keep it in a minus 183 degrees centigrade ship, and
highly pressurized.
Pressurized, and then ship it off then disembark and have it gradually warmed up at a multi-billion-dollar receiving station. Yeah. That is expensive. You lose energy. It's more costly. So at this juncture, gas is the issue, but also food that was coming from Russia and Ukraine and going down to the Middle East. It was just crossing a very narrow sea. You could have bulk carriers going back literally in a day or two and just running it down. Now that's been interrupted. And you're going to have to get grains from the U.S. or from Australia, Brazil, much longer supply runs.
Much longer. Yeah.
And this is the part that isn't going to change. I don't stop eating. That's not the demand part that changes. Maybe people cut back a little, but that's where that core inflation is right now. It's all based on this idea that they think the Fed rate is really good at choice inflation. They can affect your choices by increasing the rate and reducing the amount of money that's being put into the economy. But they can't affect my appetite. I think so. I really don't see how they're going to go.
In terms of both food and energy prices, I think on the food side, people have not put into the calculation climate change.
Well, no, we've seen that. I mean, Brazil, India, China were all affected.
And Europe.
And Europe. Strangely enough, Russia and Ukraine had bumper crops. This year. So very interesting. But question is, how do you get it out? The amount of grain coming out of Ukraine is nowhere near what it was.
Less than 1/3.
And then you can't buy Russian grain because it's very difficult for the banking side.
Sanction side. One thing that is interesting to note is speaking to friends from the northeastern provinces of China, they've signed some huge contracts for Chinese to farm Siberia.
It's unutilized land. It's fertile.
Very fertile.
Yeah.
It's unutilized. There's no labor force that will do it. So these big state-owned state farms in northeastern China are locking up million mu blocks.
Well, it's a good business decision, right?
For Russia as well.
Oh, absolutely. They're getting rents for their land.
That's right.
Otherwise would nothing.
That's right.
Because the local farmers were.
But the other part is, it's interesting. I saw some studies on this. As climate change and global warming continues, the temperature of Siberia becomes better and better for farming. So that would be interesting.
Greenland will finally maybe be a green land.
Instead of Iceland. Right?
Well, they named Iceland because they thought it was actually pretty nice. They didn't want anyone to show up. But Greenland really had a problem. So,
but
early marketing.
But what's really frightening, I've been talking to friends from Pakistan. The situation is frightening. 1/3 of the arable land is now underwater.
Yeah, I don't think people have factored in what a huge issue that's going to be. I mean, you have, 163 million people?
Yeah.
36 million of them are now
underwater, homeless.
But in addition to that, most of the fertile lands have been washed away.
And then the same thing, if you look at what happened during the heat wave in June, July, in Europe too, fertile land was basically being burned out. Same. China has the same. And the supply of fresh water all over the world.
Huge issue.
All of these impact daily lives, but also long-term impacts on agriculture and food supply. And as you know, without good food supply, social disorder.
Talking of which, we're starting to see some very, very frightening things coming out of Europe, a real swing to the right.
Yes.
In Sweden, but also in France and other areas, you're really starting to see a lot of sympathy. It's generally anti-immigrant, all right? Some of these parties are actually pro-Russian, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes. They're saying we don't want to participate in that. So you see the developed countries moving towards the right wing. And some people who you and I know have said it's not a shift to the right, it's a shift to fascism.
Yeah.
And that is really frightening when you have countries that you've depended on, supposedly maintaining the international world order, suddenly saying, we don't care. Perfect example is Germany. Everyone talks about Germany. Everything has to be according to the rules, to the book. They just went in and seized all of the Russian oil assets of Rosneft.
Yeah.
I mean, they just took it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like the U.S.
Confiscated.
No, the U.S., we confiscated everything we could lay our hands on. We're taking boats that belong to Russians. There's no procedure. There's no saying, okay, you can go to court and things like that. I think there will be court proceedings, but by then the ships will be sold and things like that. We took the Afghan money.
That's right.
And now you're starting to see European countries do exactly the same thing. They're just taking stuff.
Confiscating. In terms of Germany, we can recall, even though we weren't there, what happened in the 1930s.
Yeah. There was another taking then.
That's right.
At that time, they were all Jewish, Polish, gypsies.
What happened there is, again, according to historical records that we read about, is circumstances were dire, the economy was in hyperinflation, and people's lives were being impacted seriously, and they wanted a leader. No matter who the leader is or what they espouse.
Make the trains run on time. Right?
Yeah. And if it moves in that direction, it could be quite dangerous.
But it is moving in that direction. And that is what's frightening. And the same group that keeps talking about the rule of law, right, is the one which is moving closer and closer to right-wing extremism.
Yeah.
It's really strange. Meanwhile, let's talk about South America. You have a left wing swing there.
Uh-huh.
We've had a lot of
Mexico, Colombia, Argentina,
obviously Venezuela.
That's right.
You know, but one of the Peru, the president, is having a real hard time. He's 1 year in office. He's kind of scrambled his cabinet a number of times. Mm-hmm. He's facing corruption allegations. And when I say he's changed his cabinet, this last week he got rid of his finance minister, I believe, and because he wanted to do one thing and the finance minister wanted to do other things. Now, I would have assumed that you work that out before you appoint them, because he's only been there for a month. And it just seems strange. Is this, I mean, sometimes I say, okay, maybe he wasn't ready for things.
Prime time.
Other time I say, how much of this is due to foreign interference? How much is being stoked by other countries, especially the United States, which does not appreciate a left-swinging government in Peru. I mean, I have not heard of any indications that the U.S. is involved, but there's certainly a lot of glee in Washington and in the international press.
Well, there's been quite a history of Americans being involved.
Well, that's kind of what every time something bad happens in South America, I always think, did we do it? Did the U.S. do this? Because generally the cases...
They did.
Well, we did. A lot of those 72 regime changes we put since World War II, guess what? A lot of them were in South America.
That's right.
And we still have never apologized for any of that stuff, which is amazing. We tell... You know, we said Germany, Japan, everyone should apologize for their bad actions, right? We've told the British, you did terrible things, you know, we should, but we never seem to do that.
Have you heard about the story of Allende's daughter?
No.
Okay, I heard this. It has to be, verified.
Okay.
Allende's daughter was picked up by the secret police after he was overthrown. And she and her mother were put in jail and tortured for months. Then she escaped and was elected to the top of the government leadership, I think 6 or 7 years ago. Mm-hmm. And then she became a senior official of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. Mm-hmm. And she was the one who was preparing the report on Uyghurs in China. 2 days before the public distribution and her press conference on this report, coming out of Voice of America and Washington, were all these things about how she's corrupt, she's terrible, she's hopeless. And so
I'm sure they just found the incriminating
evidence.
Yes,
of someone
just 2 days before they were issuing a report that the U.S. didn't like.
That's right.
Yeah. And Michelle Bachelet. I mean, here's a woman who's been her left-wing credentials, let us say, are unimpeachable. Mm-hmm. She did have an issue in her cabinet, not necessarily her, with corruption, but She just came out and said the political pressure has been intense. And she issued the report the day that she was going to step down. I mean, if you're talking about human rights, it has to be based on the facts. You cannot use it as a political instrument, a blunt weapon to whack down all the people you don't like.
Oh, speaking of which, using international organizations or using various political weapons, how about the anti-proliferation scandal in Vienna? Oh. I think Atomic Energy Commission or something, mm-hmm. United Nations organization, left a loophole allowing the U.S. to supply enriched uranium to the Australians as part of the nuclear submarine program.
Yes, the IAEA, International Atomic Energy
Agency.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's bizarre. Okay, so Australia says they want nuclear submarines. Mm-hmm. Right. The nuclear submarines will be delivered at best by 2040. As I recall, this is 2022. Okay, so we're talking 18 years from now. And that's the best case scenario. They're now thinking of going back to an intermediate submarine. They have two choices. The Barracuda, that was the French submarine that they overturned in order to buy the U.S., but since they can't get the U.S., they might go back to it. Or what they call is they have a Collins-class submarine, and they might try to improve it somehow, and they call it the Son of Collins solution. Okay, so you have these kind of machinations. It's not clear. They're supposed to have reports. To set up one of these programs, you have to have incredible amounts of supply chains. They have to be set up in advance. It's not like you just start building one of these these things, start hammering on some metal and let me build you a submarine. And then they get to the realization that they are prohibited. The U.S. is prohibited from transferring nuclear
material.
No, not material per se, but they can't send the kind of nuclear-powered engines and systems from the U.S. to Australia, because that would be a clear violation of IAEA rules. Okay, so how to get around it? Well, Australia says, we'd like to have our own propulsion system, and that way we could build it here and create some jobs, and wouldn't that be lovely? So that's where they got this kind of ruling saying that, okay, you can start enriching uranium because you're using it for engines.
I think Iran wants to build some nuclear submarines as well.
No, but here's the thing. There's a clear rule that there can be no transfer of technology that can be used for military purposes. That is what the non-proliferation is about, right? It doesn't prevent you from having nuclear reactors for peacetime use, for power generation, etc. It doesn't. But it specifically prevents anyone from using transferring technology or uranium for wartime purposes. And this is clearly that. So this is the scandal. The IAEA, after years of saying that we are impartial, we enforce the rules, we don't make policies, we simply didn't. They drove a tractor trailer through a loophole in order to do it for Australia. But
for the U.S. actually.
Well, U.S. Yeah. So the U.S. can, in theory, sell submarines to Australia. Okay. We can get into this issue that China just came out with it's a missile that can go in the air, hypersonically, and in the water, also hypersonically. Okay. So let's think about it. What are submarines? Why do people have submarines? It's for this retaliatory situation. Strike. So you throw your submarine out there, dives deep, hides, and if somebody attacks you, it pops up and fires missiles at your enemies. Well, the reason a nuclear sub is useful is because it can go longer. All right.
Disappear for a
long period of time, so it's harder to track. Except now you can literally just take a drone that is a missile, right? And you can just put it anywhere. You could put thousands of them for the cost of one of these submarines, and that would give you your retaliatory strike capability. So it seems in the next 18 years, the only thing that is clear is that these submarines will become dinosaurs because they're easily tracked.
That's right.
I don't care how silent they are. If I simply throw a few hundred tracking drones outside the nuclear submarine pens where they have to go to get refueled and things like that, I can basically follow them forever. I know exactly where they are. It doesn't make any sense anymore. And yet, at a time when education, poverty, pandemic, global warming, all of these things are facing us, there seems to be unlimited amount of money for war, whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's buying weapon systems that will have no effect and will be completely obsolete even before they're delivered.
Exactly on your point. This is interesting. I was reading some reports from U.S. admirals. I don't know how much of this is trying to get more money out of Congress.
Always.
Yeah, but they talked about the hypersonic missiles that the Chinese have now, including those which are submarine killers, of course, but also nuclear carrier killers.
Okay.
One missile would do it, would do the job. But because it comes at such a high speed, it's impossible to shoot down. And then,
there are no countermeasures that work against them. Currently.
That's right. So now they're talking about what are they going to do, because you have 10 carrier task forces, right? If it cannot operate within 3,000 miles of China, or 3,000 kilometers of China, then the whole idea of having them becomes
pointless.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's always been kind of pointless. I mean, the U.S. has 400 bases surrounding China. Mm-hmm. Why you need to, have these very expensive, not only to build but also to operate carriers wandering around. I mean, I think China wants them simply for presence. Mm-hmm. So, because they don't have all these bases, having the ability for anti-piracy, mm-hmm. or if there's a humanitarian mission, or they have to get their people out mm-hmm. of a country because of deterioration. And I think that's a real issue coming up these days. Increasingly, we just have a situation where, you have to assume that things are going to be less stable rather than more.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. Another bad week.
Yeah. A good note, though, is that even while all of this stuff is happening in South America, there was a meeting of the South American scientific and Caribbean scientific community with China, and it was business as usual. They're trying to figure out ways to transfer technology, how to collaborate on creating more scientific, the kind of technology that you need to address the world's problems that we have now, whether it's energy, food, global warming, mm-hmm. all right, and also future pandemics. Mm-hmm. This isn't the last one. We don't know when the next one will be.
Hit the news today that the first case ever of monkeypox is identified in China.
I think there should be an investigation as to whether the United States was breeding monkeypox in order to send it to. I mean, this is my point. Mm-hmm. No one in China is saying that this was deliberately made in a lab and somehow, was shipped around. And I mean, the level of distrust, paranoia is, it's almost more frightening.
Unfortunately, it will get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, one hopes. One hopes. North Korea declared itself a nuclear nation. Okay. I believe that this is the signal for both Japan and South Korea. Both of, the South Korean populace, the majority of people think that in South Korea that they need a nuclear weapon. They need nuclear weapons. For a couple of reasons. One, because of North Korea. Second, they don't believe that the U.S. will protect them. And if South Korea goes nuclear, there's absolutely no way that Japan won't.
If South Korea goes nuclear, before it goes nuclear, war will break out between South and North Korea. North Korea will not allow South Korea to have that leverage over them.
It's not leverage over them. It's a question of, who can strike. And quite frankly, the South Koreans could be nuclear in a few hours, from what I understand.
Very quickly.
Yeah. They have the enriched uranium. They have the delivery systems. It would just be a question of putting the pieces together and literally doing it. But in a world which is this unstable, having more and more actors, whether it's Australia, Japan, South Korea, having more nuclear weapons.
India, Pakistan, Israel,
Yeah.
And I'm sure the Saudis...
That's the worst kept secret in the world.
Yeah.
That nuclear... I mean, Israel is estimated to have 50 to 150 nuclear warheads. Yeah. And they have made no secret of the fact that if you come onto us, we will use them.
Yep.
All right. Our final solution is to take out all of your major cities. No one talks about it. When's the last time you heard of the IAEA saying that they need a trip to Israel to verify whether or not their weapons program, where it's at, or whether they have all these things? Where are the sanctions against Israel for having developed this stuff?
Where is the IAEA's nuclear non-proliferation rules? Yeah.
Increasingly, everything seems political, not rational.
I wouldn't be surprised that countries like Saudi Arabia,
they want it.
Yep, have a nuclear program. Even UAE.
Well,
and Turkey.
But once you have once a few medium powers have it, all the medium powers are going to want it.
That's
right. It comes to national. Last topic, unless you have something, Ethereum.
Uh-huh.
They went from a proof of work where you had to invest all of this time and energy being the operative word, to in essence reset the system. So every time you change transactions, you had to basically balance the books. That's what this crypto mining is about.
Right.
It's not like some guy with a pickaxe.
That's Ethereum mining. Yeah.
I think it was literally just the way of resetting. So they moved from proof of work to proof of stake. Proof of work was the crypto mining, where you had basically your people had to reset the system, all right, by doing all this stuff. Now it's proof of stake. What you do is you put up your Ethereum coins into a little vault that is verified, and then you can basically guarantee transactions which are being done. So it's a completely different approach. It hasn't been met great, but long term, this is the beginning of what I would call a revolution, especially in transactions, specifically smart contracts. Because the key is always trust. If I give you something, will you pay me for it? Especially if we're not in the same room or even the same continent. But if there's a system to make sure that it works seamlessly, cheaply.
That's right.
Yeah. This is going to be a real big issue.
Absolute
verification.
Foolproof verification, authentication, at, like you said, cheaply.
Well, I mean,
instantly.
And that's also what China's doing with its
RMB.
e-currency.
Yeah, digital RMB.
Yeah. So I think this is an area that we're going to have to continue to keep watching.
We keep watching.
There are some problems with it in terms of if somebody becomes such a massive guarantor, they could in fact try to manipulate the system, and then that would be bad. So there's always work to be done. It'll be interesting to see how it goes.
You mean got to chase after the hackers again, huh?
Yeah, well, it's rat and cheese. The rats will always be looking for the cheese, and you have to stay one step ahead of them in terms of everything go. Everything that can be created electronically can be attacked electronically.
That's right.
So
can have a risk.
We'll see.
Okay,
that's it for this week.
The rest of today.
Yeah, all right. And to everybody else, I hope you have a good week. All our best. Take care.